Deep in the silent woods, a forgotten quarter horse stood trembling, its ribs pressing against a fragile frame. Its once proud eyes now reflected fear and despair. Abandoned and broken, it seemed to wait for the inevitable, but this day wasn't its end, it was the beginning of an unforgettable story. The forest was quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Tall trees stood like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching long across the uneven ground. Sunlight filtered through the branches in broken patches, casting an almost ethereal glow on the forest floor. It was the kind of day that felt peaceful, yet the air carried an unshakable weight, a sense of something amiss. 3 hunters moved cautiously through the woods, their boots crunching against the dry leaves. They weren't looking for trouble, just an ordinary day out for game, nothing unusual. Each step took them deeper into the heart of the forest, a place they had walked many times before but never truly noticed. The stillness today felt different, unnerving even. Then they saw it. At first, it was just a shape, half hidden behind a cluster of trees. It didn't move, and for a moment, they thought it was a fallen log or maybe an old hunting blind. But as they stepped closer, their hearts collectively dropped. There, standing shakily on thin legs, was a quarter horse. The animal looked as though it had been through a nightmare. Its coat was once a gleaming chestnut brown, but now it was matted with mud and streaked with scars. Its ribs jutted out, stark against the pale skin stretched tight over its bones. The horse's mane hung in tangled, lifeless strands, and its head drooped as if every ounce of energy had been drained from its body. But the most haunting detail was its eyes, big, dark, and filled with an emotion the hunters couldn't quite name. Fear. Sorrow. Or perhaps the resigned acceptance of a creature abandoned to its fate. Whatever it was, it gripped the men's hearts in an instant. They looked at one another, their earlier lightheartedness now replaced by a somber understanding. This horse wasn't wild. It had belonged to someone. The faint mark of a halter still pressed into its fur, and a frayed rope hung loosely from its neck, a painful reminder that this creature hadn't simply wandered here. It had been left. One of the men knelt slowly, extending a hand as he whispered soft words. The horse didn't move, only trembling slightly as though bracing itself for harm. The other hunters stood back, their faces a mixture of anger and sadness. How could someone do this? How could they abandon such a beautiful animal to fend for itself in the wild? The group didn't need to speak to decide what came next. They couldn't leave it here. This quarter horse had already suffered enough, and if they walked away now, they knew it wouldn't survive another night. The question wasn't if they would help, but how. The hunters stood silently, their eyes fixed on the frail quarter horse before them. The animal's battered appearance told a story louder than any words ever could, but it was a story they could only imagine. Who had abandoned this beautiful creature? What kind of life had it known before it ended up here, trembling and alone? The horse had once been a proud and majestic figure, full of strength and purpose. Perhaps it had been born on a small ranch, surrounded by rolling pastures and blue skies. In its early days, it likely ran freely, its powerful legs carrying it across endless fields. It was a quarter horse, after all, known for its speed, agility, and unshakable loyalty to its owner. But those glory days didn't last. The hunters could only guess at the details, but they knew the truth: someone had failed this horse. Maybe it had once been a farmer's prized possession, used to pull carts or work the fields. Quarter horses are known for their reliability, and this one had likely given everything it had, day after day, without complaint. But what happens when loyalty is met with neglect? Perhaps one day, the horse fell ill or suffered an injury that made it less useful. A limp in its stride, an illness that dulled its shine, whatever it was, it became an inconvenience. And when animals are seen as tools rather than living beings, they are discarded the moment they stop serving their purpose. The hunters noticed the frayed rope still tied loosely around its neck, the edges worn and muddy. It was a sign that this horse hadn't wandered off or gotten lost. Someone had brought it here, tied it to a tree, and left it to face the wilderness alone. The thought hit the men like a blow to the chest. Abandonment wasn't just cruel, it was a death sentence. They imagined the horse's first night in the woods. The cold creeping into its bones, the unfamiliar sounds of predators prowling in the darkness. A creature bred for companionship and service, it must have been terrified, its heart racing as it stood tethered and helpless. Maybe it had cried out for its owner, not understanding why it had been left behind. Maybe it had pulled at the rope until its neck burned, desperate to break free. And maybe, at some point, it had stopped fighting, its spirit crushed under the weight of betrayal and fear. The scars along its body told of brushes with danger, sharp branches, thorny undergrowth, or even a predator that had gotten too close. But the fact that it was still standing, still alive, spoke to a resilience that the hunters couldn't ignore. This horse had endured unimaginable pain, yet here it was, holding on against all odds. One of the hunters broke the silence. "You think it's been here for days? Weeks?" he asked, his voice tight with anger and sadness. Another shook his head, his jaw clenched. "Does it even matter? The fact that it's still breathing is a miracle." As they stood there, trying to piece together the story of this abandoned animal, a quiet determination settled over the group. This horse deserved more than the life it had been given. It deserved kindness, care, and a chance to heal. The hunters didn't know who had left it here, and they didn't need to. Their job wasn't to dwell on the cruelty of others, it was to make sure this horse never had to suffer again. They couldn't change its past, but they could give it a future. And with that thought, they prepared themselves for what would come next. Helping this quarter horse wasn't going to be easy. It was frightened, weak, and perhaps on the brink of giving up entirely. But if the horse still had the will to fight, then so did they. With slow, deliberate movements, one of the men reached out again, his hand open and steady. "We've got you now," he whispered softly. "You're not alone anymore." The quarter horse didn't move, but its trembling eased just slightly, as if it understood. This was the moment where its tragic past ended, and its journey toward hope began. The scene was still as the hunters stood beside the fragile quarter horse, their expressions a mix of determination and heartbreak. The horse barely moved, its thin frame trembling under the weight of its own despair. Its once glorious chestnut coat was now streaked with mud, and every bone beneath its skin seemed to press outward, as though the animal had been sculpted by suffering itself. The lead hunter crouched low, carefully holding the rope they had fashioned into a makeshift halter. His hand was steady, but his heart wasn't. The sight of the horse, so weak, so broken, felt like a punch to the chest. He whispered softly, his voice carrying the gentleness of someone who knew what it meant to be abandoned. "We're not here to hurt you. You're safe now." The quarter horse twitched its ears slightly, but it didn't move. Its dark eyes were glazed over, heavy with exhaustion and fear. Behind the lead hunter, his two companions stood back, their gazes flicking nervously between the animal and the thickening shadows of the forest. The air felt heavier now, the sun dipping lower in the sky and casting long, menacing shapes across the path. The first gentle tug on the rope yielded no response. The horse didn't resist, but it didn't step forward either. It was as if it had resigned itself to the idea that nothing good could come from humans anymore. One of the other hunters knelt down, pulling out a small piece of dried apple from his bag. "Here," he murmured, extending his hand. "You need this more than I do." The scent of the apple seemed to stir something deep within the horse. Its nostrils flared faintly as it leaned forward, cautiously sniffing at the offering. For a moment, it hesitated, as though weighing its options. Then, with a small movement, it took the apple into its mouth. The hunters exhaled collectively, a flicker of hope lighting in their hearts. "That's it," the first hunter whispered. "You're doing good." With slow, deliberate movements, they began coaxing the horse forward. The first step was tentative, the hoof dragging against the ground as though it weighed 100 pounds. But then came a second step, and then a third. The hunters exchanged relieved glances, their encouragement coming in soft, steady tones. The journey out of the forest was a test of endurance for both the horse and the men. The uneven terrain was littered with obstacles, fallen branches, slippery moss, and sharp rocks hidden beneath layers of leaves. Every few feet, the horse stumbled, its legs trembling violently under its weight. Each time, the hunters were there to steady it, their hands ready to catch and support. "It's okay, buddy," the lead hunter murmured, patting the horse's neck. "We're not going to let you fall." The hours dragged on, the forest growing darker with each passing minute. The sunlight that had filtered through the canopy earlier was now replaced by a dusky gloom, and the sounds of the woods changed with the fading light. The cheerful chirping of birds gave way to the haunting calls of owls and the distant howls of wolves. The men decided to take a short break when they reached a small clearing. It wasn't much, a patch of soft grass surrounded by dense undergrowth, but it was enough to give the horse a chance to rest. One of the hunters pulled out a canteen of water and poured it into a shallow bowl they had fashioned from a piece of bark. He placed it in front of the horse, stepping back to give it space. At first, the horse didn't move, its eyes darting warily between the men. But the lure of water proved too strong. Slowly, it lowered its head and began to drink, each sip slow and deliberate. The hunters watched in silence, their hearts swelling with a mix of relief and admiration. As they rested, the hunters began to notice the full extent of the horse's injuries. Its legs were scratched and bleeding in places, the wounds caked with dirt and debris. The lead hunter retrieved a small first aid kit from his pack and set to work cleaning the cuts. The horse flinched at first, its body tensing under his touch, but the hunter spoke softly to it, his voice a calming presence. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he said quietly. "But you're stronger than you think. We'll get you through this." The other hunters worked together to prepare a makeshift stretcher, just in case the horse collapsed again and couldn't continue. They used branches and their jackets, creating a sturdy frame that could support the animal's weight. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than leaving the horse behind. As the group prepared to set off again, a distant howl pierced the silence. The men froze, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. The howl was low and mournful, but it carried with it the unmistakable warning of a predator nearby. "Wolves," one of the hunters muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The horse stiffened, its ears twitching as it caught the sound. The hunters knew they had to move quickly. The forest was no place to linger, especially with darkness closing in. "Let's go," the lead hunter said firmly, tugging gently on the rope. The horse hesitated but followed, its steps slow and unsteady. The path grew steeper as they climbed a small incline, the loose rocks and tangled roots making every step a challenge. The hunters stayed close, one man leading the horse while the others guided it from behind. The climb was grueling, each step feeling like a battle against the forest itself. Halfway up the incline, the horse stumbled again, its legs giving out beneath it. The lead hunter dropped the rope and rushed to its side, wrapping his arms around its neck to steady it. "I've got you," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We're not giving up." The other hunters quickly joined him, their hands supporting the horse as it struggled to stand. Together, they coaxed it back onto its feet, their encouragement steady and unwavering. By the time they reached the top of the incline, the hunters were drenched in sweat and breathing heavily. The horse, too, was exhausted, its sides heaving with labored breaths. But there was a glimmer of strength in its eyes now, a flicker of the spirit that had carried it through so much. The forest began to thin as they continued their journey, the dense trees giving way to open fields. The hunters knew they were nearing safety, but they also knew the horse wasn't out of danger yet. It needed medical attention, food, and rest, things they couldn't provide in the middle of the woods. As they stepped out into the open field, the horse paused, its ears flicking forward. The hunters stopped too, turning to look at the animal. For the first time since they had found it, the horse lifted its head high, its posture strong and proud. "You did it," the lead hunter said softly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You made it. The forest, now cloaked in twilight, was a challenging place to navigate even for experienced hunters. The path ahead seemed endless, its uneven terrain riddled with obstacles that tested their endurance and patience. Leading the fragile quarter horse through the darkness was proving to be the most grueling task they had ever faced. The horse's condition was deteriorating. Its steps were slower now, each one heavier than the last, as though the weight of its battered body was too much to bear. Its labored breathing filled the silence, a haunting reminder of how close it had come to giving up entirely. The hunters knew they couldn't stop for long, time wasn't on their side. The forest had eyes in the dark, and every second spent here increased the risk of an encounter they weren't prepared for. Let's keep moving, the lead hunter said, his voice steady but urgent. He gave the rope a gentle tug, coaxing the horse forward. Just a little further. We're getting closer to safety. The other two hunters walked on either side of the animal, their movements cautious yet firm. Each carried a flashlight, the narrow beams cutting through the murky shadows of the woods. The light flickered against the trees, illuminating patches of undergrowth and the occasional startled animal darting away. The horse hesitated frequently, its body language screaming fear and exhaustion. At one point, it stopped entirely, planting its hooves firmly into the ground as if to say, I can't go on. The lead hunter turned back, crouching low to meet the horse's weary eyes. We're not leaving you here, he said softly, his hand resting gently on its neck. You've come too far to give up now. The second hunter reached into his pack and pulled out the last of the dried apple slices. He held one out to the horse, waiting patiently as it sniffed the air cautiously. After a moment, it took the offering, chewing slowly. You're doing great, the second hunter murmured, stroking the horse's mane with careful hands. We'll get you out of this, I promise. The simple act of feeding the horse seemed to restore a glimmer of trust. It took a tentative step forward, then another, its head hanging low but its body inching onward. The hunters exchanged relieved glances, their shared determination reigniting. The faint howl of a wolf echoed in the distance, causing all three hunters to stop in their tracks. The sound was distant but unmistakable, its mournful tone cutting through the night like a blade. The lead hunter tightened his grip on the rope, his eyes scanning the shadows. Stay close, he instructed, his voice firm but quiet. The horse's ears twitched nervously, its body tensing under the weight of the unspoken threat. The hunters knew that wolves rarely attacked humans, but an injured horse was an entirely different story. The scent of blood from its untreated wounds would draw predators like moths to a flame. As they continued forward, the howls grew louder, now joined by the rustling of leaves and the snapping of twigs. The lead hunter motioned for the others to form a protective circle around the horse, their flashlights sweeping across the underbrush in search of movement. There's more than one, the third hunter whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. The horse shifted nervously, its hooves scuffing against the dirt. The lead hunter placed a calming hand on its neck, whispering soothing words. It's okay. We've got you. The rustling grew louder, closer, until the glowing eyes of a wolf appeared in the beam of a flashlight. Then another pair, and another. A low growl emanated from the darkness, and the hunters knew they had no choice but to stand their ground. Get the flares, the lead hunter ordered. The third hunter quickly reached into his pack, pulling out a handful of emergency flares. He lit one, the bright red glow casting eerie shadows across the trees. The wolves hesitated, their growls turning into cautious whines as the light disrupted their approach. The lead hunter took a step forward, waving the flare in a wide arc. Get out of here, he shouted, his voice echoing through the forest. The wolves backed off slightly, their glowing eyes watching warily from the shadows. But they didn't leave. They were patient, circling just beyond the reach of the light, waiting for the moment when the humans let their guard down. We can't stay here, the second hunter said, his voice strained. They're not going to give up. The lead hunter nodded, his jaw clenched. Let's move. Keep the flares going, and stay close to the horse. The group moved quickly, their flashlights and flares cutting through the oppressive darkness. The horse, though clearly terrified, followed their lead, its trust in the hunters growing with every step. It stumbled once, nearly falling, but the men were there to catch it, their hands steady and supportive. "You're doing great," the lead hunter said, his voice calm despite the tension in the air. "Just a little further." The howls faded gradually as the group pressed on, the wolves seemingly losing interest as they moved farther from their territory. The hunters didn't relax, though, their senses heightened by the adrenaline coursing through their veins. They knew the forest still held dangers they hadn't yet encountered. After what felt like hours, the dense forest began to thin, the trees giving way to open land. The first rays of moonlight spilled onto the path, illuminating the way forward. The hunters paused, their breaths heavy but their spirits lifting. "We're almost there," the lead hunter said, his voice filled with quiet relief. The horse stopped too, its head lifting slightly as if sensing the change. Its eyes, though still weary, held a flicker of something the hunters hadn't seen before: hope. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, they felt like they were moving towards safety rather than away from danger. The moonlight spilled onto the clearing, casting a faint silvery glow on the path ahead. The dense forest behind them seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, its shadows fading into the background as the hunters and the quarter horse stepped into the open. But even with the faint light to guide them, the group knew they were far from safe. The journey was far from over. The horse's condition remained precarious. Its steps were slow, its legs trembling as if each movement was draining the last of its strength. The lead hunter tugged gently on the rope, his voice low and steady. "Come on, buddy. You're doing so well. Just a little further." The other hunters flanked the horse, their flashlights sweeping the path for obstacles. They were out of the wolves' territory for now, but the forest had other dangers lurking in its quieter corners. Every rustle of leaves and crack of twigs kept their nerves on edge, their senses sharp. The terrain became more challenging as they moved forward. The path dipped into a shallow ravine, where a small stream trickled through the rocky ground. The rocks were slick with moss, and the water, though shallow, posed a significant risk for the weakened horse. The lead hunter stopped, assessing the situation. "We're going to have to take it slow here," he said, turning to his companions. "This is tricky even for us, and he's barely standing as it is." The second hunter nodded, stepping forward to steady the horse. "I'll guide his legs," he said, crouching beside the animal. The group moved cautiously, each step deliberate and calculated. The lead hunter led the way, picking out the safest path across the rocks, while the other two supported the horse from either side. The animal's hooves slipped several times, and each time, the hunters caught it, their hands steady despite the strain on their muscles. "You've got this," one of them murmured, patting the horse's neck. "Just a little more." When they finally reached the other side of the ravine, the hunters allowed themselves a moment to breathe. The horse stood trembling but upright, its sides heaving with effort. The lead hunter crouched down in front of it, offering another piece of dried apple. "You're a fighter," he said softly, stroking its muzzle. "We're going to get you out of this." As the hours stretched on, the physical and emotional toll of the journey became increasingly apparent. The hunters were exhausted, their bodies aching from the constant strain of guiding and supporting the horse. Their clothes were damp with sweat, and their faces were streaked with dirt and grime. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. The horse, despite its exhaustion, seemed to draw strength from their determination. It stumbled less frequently now, its steps more deliberate as if it had begun to trust the hunters completely. The bond between them was growing stronger with every mile, an unspoken understanding forming between man and animal. "We're going to make it," the lead hunter said aloud, more to himself than anyone else. The words felt like a promise, not just to the horse but to his companions as well. The group's resolve was tested yet again when they encountered a hidden threat. As they walked along a narrow path bordered by thick underbrush, the horse suddenly froze, its ears swiveling forward. The hunters stopped in their tracks, their flashlights darting nervously across the foliage. "What is it?" one of them whispered. Before anyone could respond, a low growl rumbled from the shadows. The lead hunter's flashlight landed on the source, a mountain lion, crouched low among the bushes, its golden eyes fixed on the group. The hunters reacted instantly. The lead hunter stepped forward, raising his arms to make himself appear larger. "Back off," he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. The mountain lion didn't move, its body coiled like a spring, ready to pounce. The horse let out a terrified whinny, its hooves stamping against the ground as it backed away. "Stay calm," the second hunter said, reaching for the flare gun in his pack. "Don't make any sudden moves." The third hunter grabbed a thick branch from the ground, holding it like a club. "We're not losing him now," he muttered under his breath. The second hunter fired the flare into the air, the bright red light bursting above them in a brilliant display. The mountain lion flinched, its eyes darting upward before retreating into the shadows. The hunters held their ground, their breaths heavy as they watched the predator disappear into the darkness. "That was too close," the lead hunter said, his voice shaking slightly. The horse was still trembling, its body pressed tightly against the second hunter for comfort. The lead hunter stroked its neck, whispering soothing words. "It's okay. You're safe. We won't let anything happen to you." The group pressed on, their nerves frayed but their determination unshaken. The moon had risen high above them, its pale light providing just enough visibility to navigate the forest. The temperature had dropped, and the cool night air bit at their skin, but they hardly noticed. The horse, though exhausted, seemed to draw strength from the hunter's presence. Its steps were slow but steady, its head held just a little higher than before. The hunters took turns walking beside it, their hands resting on its neck or shoulder to provide reassurance. They didn't speak much, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. Each man was lost in his own thoughts, reflecting on the events of the day and the challenges that still lay ahead. Just when it felt like the night would never end, the faint glow of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The forest, which had seemed so ominous in the dark, began to feel less threatening. The lead hunter paused, turning to look at the horse. "We made it through the night," he said, his voice filled with quiet relief. The horse lifted its head, its ears flicking forward as if it, too, could sense the shift in the atmosphere. The hunters smiled at one another, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Let's keep going," the lead hunter said. "We're almost there." The path ahead was still long, but the hunters knew they were on the right track. The horse's steps grew stronger with each passing moment, its spirit slowly returning as the sun rose higher in the sky. For the first time since the journey had begun, the hunters allowed themselves to hope. They weren't just leading the horse to safety, they were giving it a second chance at life. The warmth of the morning sun brought renewed hope to the weary group. The hunters and the quarter horse had made it through a night filled with trials, and now, as daylight illuminated their path, the end of the journey seemed closer than ever. The dense forest had given way to open fields dotted with patches of wildflowers, and the air felt lighter, less oppressive. The horse, though still visibly weak, walked with more confidence now. Each step seemed less like a struggle and more like a determined march forward. The hunters took turns leading the animal, their bond with it deepened by the trials they had endured together. For the first time in hours, the hunters felt a sense of calm. The open landscape stretched out before them, the golden grass swaying gently in the breeze. It was a stark contrast to the suffocating shadows of the forest, and the group relished the change. The horse lifted its head, its ears flicking as it sniffed the air. It was as though it could sense that safety was within reach. The lead hunter chuckled softly. "You smell it too, don't you? Home's not far now." They followed a narrow dirt path that wound its way through the fields, the sunlight warming their tired bodies. Despite their exhaustion, the hunters couldn't help but admire the beauty around them. Birds flitted from bush to bush, their songs filling the air with a sense of peace. But the journey was far from over. The hunters knew that the horse's ordeal wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The trauma it had endured wouldn't vanish simply because it was out of danger. As they walked, the lead hunter spoke quietly to the animal, his words a soothing balm to its frayed nerves. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he murmured, his hand resting gently on its neck. "But you're stronger than you think. You've made it this far, and we're not going to let you down now." The horse seemed to respond to his words, its steps growing steadier. It wasn't just surviving anymore, it was starting to fight for itself. The hunters decided to stop near a small stream that cut through the field, giving the horse a chance to rest and drink. As the animal lowered its head to the water, the lead hunter took a moment to check its wounds. The cuts and scrapes from the forest were beginning to scab over, but they would need proper treatment soon. One of the other hunters pulled out the last of their supplies, a handful of dried fruit and some bread. "This is all we've got left," he said with a wry smile. "But I think our friend here deserves it more than we do." The horse eagerly accepted the offering, its movements less hesitant now. The hunters watched with quiet satisfaction, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. As they resumed their journey, the path began to slope gently upward. In the distance, the hunters could see the outline of a small ranch, their destination. The sight filled them with a renewed sense of purpose. "We're almost there," the lead hunter said, his voice filled with quiet determination. The horse seemed to sense the significance of the moment. Its ears perked up, and its steps quickened, as though it, too, could see the finish line. The hunters exchanged smiles, their spirits lifting as they drew closer to safety. When they finally arrived at the ranch, the group was greeted by a kind-faced woman in her late 50s. She was the ranch owner, someone the hunters knew they could trust to care for the horse. Her eyes widened as she took in the animal's condition, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, you poor thing," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. The lead hunter handed her the rope, his expression serious. "We found him in the woods. He's been through hell, but he's a fighter." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you for bringing him here. We'll take good care of him, I promise." The horse stood quietly, its dark eyes watching the woman as though trying to gauge her intentions. She approached slowly, her movements calm and deliberate. When she reached out to touch its muzzle, the horse didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned into her hand, a soft whinny escaping its lips. The hunters watched in silence, their hearts swelling with pride and relief. They had done their part, and now the horse was in safe hands. The moment of goodbye was bittersweet. The hunters had formed a bond with the horse, one forged through struggle and perseverance. Letting go wasn't easy, but they knew it was the right thing to do. The lead hunter crouched beside the animal, his hand resting on its neck. "You're going to be okay now," he said softly. "This is your chance to start over." The horse nudged him gently, its dark eyes filled with something that could only be described as gratitude. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. As the hunters turned to leave, they glanced back one last time. The horse stood beside the woman, its posture stronger than it had been when they first found it. It looked like it belonged there, like it had finally found a place to heal. The walk back to their truck was quiet. The hunters were too tired to talk, their minds replaying the events of the past 24 hours. They had set out on a simple hunting trip, but what they had found was so much more than they could have ever anticipated. "That horse," one of them said finally, breaking the silence. "It's something special, isn't it?" The lead hunter nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yeah. It's a survivor. Just needed someone to believe in it." Back at the ranch, the woman worked tirelessly to nurse the quarter horse back to health. She cleaned its wounds, fed it nourishing meals, and gave it the love and care it had been denied for so long. Slowly but surely, the horse began to heal, not just physically, but emotionally as well. The hunters visited the ranch a few weeks later to check on their friend. What they saw brought tears to their eyes. The horse was out in the pasture, its coat shining in the sunlight and its eyes bright with life. It looked nothing like the frail, broken animal they had found in the woods. As they stood at the fence, the horse trotted over to them, its head held high. It stopped in front of the lead hunter, nudging his shoulder with a playful energy that hadn't been there before. "You're a fighter," the lead hunter said, his voice thick with emotion. "We always knew you were." The horse whinnied softly, as if to say thank you. The warmth of the morning sun brought renewed hope to the weary group. The hunters and the quarter horse had made it through a night filled with trials, and now, as daylight illuminated their path, the end of the journey seemed closer than ever. The dense forest had given way to open fields dotted with patches of wildflowers, and the air felt lighter, less oppressive. The horse, though still visibly weak, walked with more confidence now. Each step seemed less like a struggle and more like a determined march forward. The hunters took turns leading the animal, their bond with it deepened by the trials they had endured together. For the first time in hours, the hunters felt a sense of calm. The open landscape stretched out before them, the golden grass swaying gently in the breeze. It was a stark contrast to the suffocating shadows of the forest, and the group relished the change. The horse lifted its head, its ears flicking as it sniffed the air. It was as though it could sense that safety was within reach. The lead hunter chuckled softly. "You smell it too, don't you? Home's not far now." They followed a narrow dirt path that wound its way through the fields, the sunlight warming their tired bodies. Despite their exhaustion, the hunters couldn't help but admire the beauty around them. Birds flitted from bush to bush, their songs filling the air with a sense of peace. But the journey was far from over. The hunters knew that the horse's ordeal wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The trauma it had endured wouldn't vanish simply because it was out of danger. As they walked, the lead hunter spoke quietly to the animal, his words a soothing balm to its frayed nerves. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he murmured, his hand resting gently on its neck. "But you're stronger than you think. You've made it this far, and we're not going to let you down now." The horse seemed to respond to his words, its steps growing steadier. It wasn't just surviving anymore, it was starting to fight for itself. The hunters decided to stop near a small stream that cut through the field, giving the horse a chance to rest and drink. As the animal lowered its head to the water, the lead hunter took a moment to check its wounds. The cuts and scrapes from the forest were beginning to scab over, but they would need proper treatment soon. One of the other hunters pulled out the last of their supplies, a handful of dried fruit and some bread. "This is all we've got left," he said with a wry smile. "But I think our friend here deserves it more than we do." The horse eagerly accepted the offering, its movements less hesitant now. The hunters watched with quiet satisfaction, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. As they resumed their journey, the path began to slope gently upward. In the distance, the hunters could see the outline of a small ranch, their destination. The sight filled them with a renewed sense of purpose. "We're almost there," the lead hunter said, his voice filled with quiet determination. The horse seemed to sense the significance of the moment. Its ears perked up, and its steps quickened, as though it, too, could see the finish line. The hunters exchanged smiles, their spirits lifting as they drew closer to safety. When they finally arrived at the ranch, the group was greeted by a kind-faced woman in her late 50s. She was the ranch owner, someone the hunters knew they could trust to care for the horse. Her eyes widened as she took in the animal's condition, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, you poor thing," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. The lead hunter handed her the rope, his expression serious. "We found him in the woods. He's been through hell, but he's a fighter." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you for bringing him here. We'll take good care of him, I promise." The horse stood quietly, its dark eyes watching the woman as though trying to gauge her intentions. She approached slowly, her movements calm and deliberate. When she reached out to touch its muzzle, the horse didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned into her hand, a soft whinny escaping its lips. The hunters watched in silence, their hearts swelling with pride and relief. They had done their part, and now the horse was in safe hands. The moment of goodbye was bittersweet. The hunters had formed a bond with the horse, one forged through struggle and perseverance. Letting go wasn't easy, but they knew it was the right thing to do. The lead hunter crouched beside the animal, his hand resting on its neck. "You're going to be okay now," he said softly. "This is your chance to start over." The horse nudged him gently, its dark eyes filled with something that could only be described as gratitude. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. As the hunters turned to leave, they glanced back one last time. The horse stood beside the woman, its posture stronger than it had been when they first found it. It looked like it belonged there, like it had finally found a place to heal. The walk back to their truck was quiet. The hunters were too tired to talk, their minds replaying the events of the past 24 hours. They had set out on a simple hunting trip, but what they had found was so much more than they could have ever anticipated. "That horse," one of them said finally, breaking the silence. "It's something special, isn't it?" The lead hunter nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yeah. It's a survivor. Just needed someone to believe in it." Back at the ranch, the woman worked tirelessly to nurse the quarter horse back to health. She cleaned its wounds, fed it nourishing meals, and gave it the love and care it had been denied for so long. Slowly but surely, the horse began to heal, not just physically, but emotionally as well. The hunters visited the ranch a few weeks later to check on their friend. What they saw brought tears to their eyes. The horse was out in the pasture, its coat shining in the sunlight and its eyes bright with life. It looked nothing like the frail, broken animal they had found in the woods. As they stood at the fence, the horse trotted over to them, its head held high. It stopped in front of the lead hunter, nudging his shoulder with a playful energy that hadn't been there before. "You're a fighter," the lead hunter said, his voice thick with emotion. "We always knew you were." The horse whinnied softly, as if to say thank you. The hunters had left the ranch with a mixture of relief and lingering attachment, knowing they had done everything in their power to give the quarter horse a chance at a new life. But their journey with the animal had ended, and now the horse's recovery was in the hands of the ranch owner. The woman, Sarah, had spent years rescuing and rehabilitating neglected animals. Her ranch was a sanctuary for the abandoned and abused, a place where broken spirits could find healing. As she led the quarter horse into its new pen, she took a deep breath, already formulating a plan to nurse it back to health. The horse, however, was far from at ease. It stood motionless in the middle of the pen, its head hanging low and its ears pinned back. The fresh straw underfoot and the clean water in the trough nearby seemed to mean nothing to it. Sarah could see the fear etched into its every movement, or lack thereof. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" she murmured, her voice soft and steady. She kept her distance, knowing that trust couldn't be rushed. "But you're safe now. No one's going to hurt you here." The first few days at the ranch were difficult for the horse. It barely ate, nibbling only sparingly at the fresh hay Sarah provided. Even the water, clean and cool, was left mostly untouched. Sarah observed from a distance, her heart aching as she watched the animal tremble at every sound, every movement near its pen. To help the horse acclimate, Sarah decided to establish a quiet, predictable routine. She would approach the pen at the same time every morning, her movements slow and deliberate. She spoke softly, her words a gentle reassurance that no harm would come. She would leave a few pieces of apple or carrot on the edge of the trough, stepping back to give the horse space. By the end of the first week, the horse began to show faint signs of trust. It would take cautious steps toward the trough once Sarah had moved away, sniffing at the treats before eating them. Its eyes, once clouded with fear, held a flicker of curiosity. Sarah knew that the horse's physical recovery was just as important as its emotional healing. She brought in a trusted veterinarian to assess its condition. The vet, a kind man named Dr. Harris, examined the horse thoroughly. "He's malnourished, of course," he said, running a hand along the animal's side. "But it's amazing he's even standing after what he's been through. These cuts and scrapes will heal with time, but he'll need proper nutrition and rest." Dr. Harris prescribed a specialized diet to help the horse regain its strength. Sarah followed his instructions diligently, preparing warm mashes filled with nutrients and supplements. She spent hours in the kitchen, mixing and measuring, pouring her care into every meal. At first, the horse was hesitant to eat. Sarah would place the bowl at the edge of the pen, stepping back to watch. Over time, the animal began to approach more confidently, its appetite slowly returning. One morning, as Sarah cleaned the pen, she noticed the horse watching her. Its dark eyes followed her movements, its ears flicking forward with interest. She paused, holding her breath. Then, without any prompting, the horse took a tentative step toward her. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. Sarah lowered herself to the ground, her posture non-threatening. She held out her hand, palm open, and waited. The horse hesitated, its body tensed, but after a long moment, it stretched its neck and sniffed her hand. Tears pricked Sarah's eyes as she whispered, "That's it. You're doing so well." From that day forward, the bond between Sarah and the horse began to grow. She named him Chance, a reflection of the new life he had been given. Chance began to respond to her presence, approaching the trough even while she was nearby. He allowed her to stroke his neck, his muscles twitching slightly at first but eventually relaxing under her touch. With trust slowly building, Sarah started incorporating gentle exercises into Chance's routine. She led him around the pen with a soft lead rope, encouraging him to move at his own pace. His steps were shaky, his legs still weak from months of neglect, but he followed her lead. Each day, they walked a little further. Sarah's voice was a constant source of encouragement, her words soothing and steady. "That's it, Chance. One step at a time. You're stronger than you think." By the end of the second week, Chance's movements had become more fluid. His coat, once dull and matted, had started to regain its natural shine thanks to Sarah's care and grooming. His eyes, too, seemed brighter, no longer clouded with fear. The first true breakthrough came one sunny afternoon. Sarah had left the gate to the pen open as she worked nearby, confident that Chance wouldn't wander far. She glanced up from her task to find him standing just outside the gate, his ears pricked and his posture alert. He was exploring, not running away, but exploring. Sarah watched silently as Chance took a few cautious steps into the open field beyond the pen. His hooves pressed into the soft grass, and for the first time since he had arrived, he lifted his head high, his nostrils flaring as he took in the fresh air. It was a sight that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Chance was rediscovering the world, one small step at a time. That evening, Sarah sat on the edge of the pen, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and orange. Chance approached her, his steps confident but unhurried. He stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Hey there," she said softly, holding out her hand. This time, Chance didn't hesitate. He moved closer, his muzzle brushing against her palm. It was a gesture of trust, a moment that solidified the bond between them. "You've come so far," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're going to be okay, Chance. I promise." Chance's progress over the next few weeks was nothing short of remarkable. Sarah's dedication to his care, coupled with the quiet resilience buried deep within the quarter horse, had begun to transform him into a shadow of the powerful creature he had once been. Still, the road ahead remained long, and the scars of his past lingered in subtle ways. Sarah introduced light exercises into Chance's daily routine. Each morning, after his feeding and grooming, she would take him out to the larger paddock where he could stretch his legs and rediscover the freedom of movement. At first, Chance was hesitant to leave the safety of his pen. The wide-open space seemed to unnerve him, as though it reminded him of the wilderness where he had been abandoned. "You're safe now, Chance," Sarah would say, her voice calm but encouraging. "No one's going to hurt you here." She began by walking him around the paddock on a lead rope, her movements slow and deliberate. His steps were unsure, his legs still unsteady, but over time, he grew more confident. Sarah celebrated even the smallest victories, a smoother stride, a flick of his tail, or a playful toss of his head. One sunny afternoon, Sarah decided to try something new. She led Chance into the paddock, then unclipped the lead rope, stepping back to give him space. For a moment, he stood still, his dark eyes scanning the open field as if searching for hidden dangers. Then, tentatively, he took a step forward, his hooves pressing into the soft earth. Sarah watched in silence as Chance began to explore. His movements were slow at first, but soon he broke into a light trot, his legs moving with a fluidity that had been absent for so long. The sight brought a lump to her throat. This was more than just a physical recovery, it was a reclamation of his spirit. As Chance grew stronger, Sarah introduced him to the other animals on the ranch. She wanted him to feel a sense of belonging, to know that he wasn't alone. The first introduction was to a gentle old mare named Daisy, whose calm demeanor made her the perfect companion for the skittish quarter horse. Sarah led Chance into the adjacent paddock, where Daisy was grazing peacefully. The mare lifted her head, her ears flicking forward as she noticed the newcomer. Chance froze, his body tensing as he watched her approach. Daisy, unbothered, walked up to him and sniffed his muzzle. After a moment, Chance relaxed, his ears swiveling forward as he cautiously returned the gesture. Sarah smiled, leaning against the fence as she watched the two horses interact. "See, Chance," she said softly. "You're not alone anymore." Over time, Chance began to bond with Daisy and the other animals on the ranch. Their presence seemed to ease his nerves, and he started to display behaviors that Sarah hadn't seen before, nuzzling the other horses, rolling in the dirt, and even nickering softly when she approached. One afternoon, Sarah decided it was time to test Chance's trust in her. She brought out a saddle and bridle, not to ride him but to see how he would react. She approached him slowly, speaking softly to keep him calm. "This isn't going to hurt," she said, holding the saddle out for him to see. "I just want to see how you feel about it." Chance's ears flicked back nervously, but he didn't move away. Sarah placed the saddle gently on his back, watching for any signs of discomfort. He flinched slightly but didn't resist. "Good boy," Sarah murmured, her hands moving with practiced care as she adjusted the straps. She didn't tighten them too much, knowing that this was only the first step. Over the next few days, Sarah continued to work with Chance, gradually increasing the time he spent wearing the saddle. Each session ended with a reward, a piece of apple or a soft stroke along his neck. The true turning point came one crisp morning as the autumn leaves began to fall. Sarah decided to let Chance roam the largest pasture on the ranch, a sprawling field bordered by wooden fences and dotted with trees. She opened the gate, stepping aside to let him through. Chance walked forward slowly, his ears swiveling as he took in the vast expanse before him. For a moment, he hesitated, his body tensing as if he were waiting for something to go wrong. But then, as if a switch had flipped, he took off at a gallop. Sarah watched in awe as Chance raced across the field, his chestnut coat gleaming in the sunlight. His movements were powerful and graceful, each stride a testament to his resilience. He kicked up his heels, tossing his head with a joyous energy that made Sarah's heart swell. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "You're free, Chance. You're finally free." A few weeks later, the hunters returned to the ranch to check on Chance. Sarah greeted them with a warm smile, her face glowing with pride. "You're just in time," she said, leading them to the pasture. The hunters stopped in their tracks when they saw him. The frail, trembling horse they had rescued from the woods was gone. In his place stood a strong, spirited animal, his coat shining and his eyes bright. "He looks amazing," one of the hunters said, his voice filled with emotion. Sarah nodded, her gaze never leaving Chance. "He's come a long way. But he couldn't have done it without you. You gave him a second chance." The lead hunter approached the fence, whistling softly. Chance's ears perked up, and he trotted over, his steps confident and steady. He stopped in front of the hunter, nudging his shoulder with a playful nuzzle. "You remember us, don't you?" the hunter said, his voice thick with emotion. Chance whinnied softly, as if to say yes. As the hunters prepared to leave, Sarah stood beside them, her hands resting on the fence. "He's going to be okay," she said, her voice steady. "He's not just surviving anymore, he's thriving." The hunters nodded, their expressions a mix of pride and gratitude. They had saved Chance's life, but in doing so, they had also been reminded of the power of compassion and resilience. As they drove away, Chance galloped across the pasture, his mane flying in the wind. He was no longer the abandoned horse they had found in the woods. He was a survivor, a fighter, and a symbol of hope. The sun was setting over the ranch, casting the world in hues of gold and crimson. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of hay and wildflowers, and the gentle sounds of horses whinnying in the distance created an atmosphere of calm. Chance stood at the edge of the pasture, his chestnut coat gleaming in the fading light. He looked nothing like the frail, frightened creature that had been pulled from the woods weeks ago. Now, he was strong, proud, and full of life. But this wasn't the end of Chance's story. This was the moment where everything he had endured, everything he had fought for, culminated in a decision that would define his future. It was late afternoon when the familiar rumble of a truck pulling into the driveway caught Sarah's attention. She wiped her hands on her jeans and stepped out of the barn, her heart lifting as she recognized the three hunters who had brought Chance to her. "Perfect timing," she called, waving them over. "I was just about to take Chance out to the big pasture." The hunters climbed out of the truck, their faces lighting up at the sight of Sarah. But their excitement was palpable as their eyes scanned the property, searching for the horse they had saved. "Where is he?" the lead hunter asked, his voice tinged with anticipation. Sarah gestured toward the pasture, a proud smile spreading across her face. "He's waiting for you." The hunters followed her through the gate, their boots crunching against the gravel as they approached the pasture. When they saw Chance, their steps faltered. "Is that him?" one of the hunters whispered, his voice barely audible. Chance turned his head at the sound of their voices, his ears swiveling forward. The hunters froze as the horse began to trot toward them, his strides powerful and confident. When he reached the fence, he stopped, his dark eyes locking onto theirs. "He remembers you," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with emotion. The lead hunter stepped forward, his hand resting on the fence. Chance leaned in, his muzzle brushing against the man's hand in a gesture of recognition. The hunter chuckled, his eyes misty. "You've come a long way, buddy." After a few minutes of quiet interaction, Sarah spoke up. "I've been thinking about what's next for Chance," she began, her tone thoughtful. The hunters turned to her, their curiosity piqued. "I've done everything I can to help him recover," Sarah continued. "But I believe he's ready for something more. He's strong enough now to have a purpose again, to be part of something bigger than himself." The lead hunter tilted his head. "What are you thinking?" Sarah smiled. "I'd like to train him for therapeutic riding." The hunters exchanged glances, their interest evident. "There's a center not far from here," Sarah explained. "They work with kids and veterans, people who have been through their own kinds of struggles. Horses like Chance, who've known hardship and come through it stronger, have a unique way of connecting with them." The second hunter nodded slowly. "Makes sense. He'd be giving back, just like someone gave him a second chance." The lead hunter looked at Chance, his expression softening. "You think he's ready for that?" Sarah smiled, her eyes glistening with pride. I do. But there's one more thing I'd like to do before we make that decision. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah led Chance to the largest pasture on the ranch. The hunters followed, their footsteps silent as they watched the scene unfold. The field stretched as far as the eye could see, bordered by sturdy wooden fences that glowed faintly in the twilight. Sarah stopped at the gate, her hand resting on the latch. She turned to the hunters, her expression serious but hopeful. This is his chance to show us who he's become, she said. If he runs, we let him. If he stays, we know he's ready to move forward. The lead hunter nodded, his gaze steady. Let's see what he does. Sarah opened the gate, stepping aside to let Chance through. The horse hesitated for a moment, his dark eyes scanning the open field. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, he broke into a gallop. The hunters watched in awe as Chance raced across the pasture, his mane and tail flying in the wind. His movements were fluid and powerful, each stride a testament to his strength and resilience. He ran to the far edge of the field, where he stopped and turned, his silhouette framed by the setting sun. For a moment, the hunters held their breath, unsure of what he would do next. Then, to their astonishment, Chance began to trot back toward them. His pace quickened as he approached, his ears pricked and his eyes bright. When he reached the group, he stopped, his chest heaving but his posture proud. He chose to stay, Sarah said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. The decision was made that night. Chance would be trained as a therapy horse, his journey from abandonment to redemption serving as an inspiration for others. Over the next several weeks, Sarah worked tirelessly to prepare him for his new role. The training was slow and methodical, designed to build trust and confidence. Chance learned how to respond to gentle commands, how to stay calm in unfamiliar situations, and how to connect with the people who would come to rely on him. The hunters visited often, each time marveling at the progress he had made. He's not just surviving anymore, the lead hunter said during one visit. He's thriving. Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with pride. And he's going to change lives, just like you changed his. The day of Chance's first therapy session arrived on a crisp autumn morning. Sarah led him into the arena, where a small group of children waited with eager anticipation. Each child had faced their own challenges, physical disabilities, emotional trauma, or the lingering scars of illness. Chance stood quietly as the first child approached, his posture calm but alert. The little girl, no more than 8 years old, reached out with trembling hands to touch his muzzle. Chance lowered his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. The connection was immediate and profound. The girl's face lit up with a smile, her nervousness melting away. "He's so gentle," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. Sarah watched from a distance, her heart swelling with pride. This was what Chance had been meant for, not just to survive, but to heal others in ways that words never could. As the weeks turned into months, Chance became a cornerstone of the therapy program. His story spread throughout the community, inspiring people from all walks of life. Visitors came to the ranch not just to meet him, but to hear the tale of his journey, from the darkness of the woods to the light of the pasture, from a place of abandonment to a role of purpose and love. The hunters, too, became regulars at the ranch. They watched with pride as Chance changed the lives of the people he met, each interaction a reminder of why they had fought so hard to save him. One day, as the lead hunter stood by the fence watching Chance work with a group of veterans, he turned to Sarah. "He's not just a horse," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's a symbol. A reminder that no matter how broken you feel, there's always a way back." Sarah smiled, her gaze never leaving Chance. "He's more than that," she said softly. "He's a miracle." The ranch stood still in the soft glow of the setting sun, a testament to the quiet beauty of resilience and recovery. As Sarah leaned against the fence, watching Chance graze peacefully in the open pasture, she couldn't help but reflect on the incredible journey that had brought him here. Chance was no longer the frail, broken creature that had been pulled from the woods. He was strong now, his chestnut coat shining and his movements confident. But more than that, he had found a purpose, a way to heal others while continuing to heal himself. For Sarah, Chance's transformation was a constant reminder of the power of compassion. It wasn't just the food, the shelter, or the care that had saved him. It was the belief that he deserved a second chance, that his story wasn't over just because someone else had given up on him. The hunters who had found Chance had never imagined that their decision to save a starving horse would lead to something so profound. They had acted on instinct, guided by a sense of right and wrong, and in doing so, they had changed the course of a life. Their visits to the ranch had become less frequent, but every time they came, they were met with the sight of Chance thriving. The lead hunter often stood silently by the fence, watching the horse work with children or veterans. To him, Chance wasn't just a rescue, he was a reflection of what could happen when people chose kindness over indifference. "He's proof that no one is beyond saving," the hunter said during one visit, his voice quiet but firm. "Sometimes all it takes is one act of compassion to change everything." Chance's story spread far beyond the ranch. Sarah often received letters from people who had heard about the quarter horse that had been rescued from the brink of death. They wrote about how his journey inspired them to find their own strength, to believe in second chances, and to look at the world with a little more empathy. The ranch became a sanctuary not just for animals but for people, too, a place where stories of survival were celebrated and where broken spirits could find healing. Chance became its heart, a living, breathing symbol of hope. As Sarah watched Chance lift his head and trot toward the group of children waiting by the fence, she felt a swell of pride and gratitude. She thought of the hunters who had brought him here, the nights spent nursing him back to health, and the moments of doubt and triumph that had defined his journey. Chance wasn't just a horse. He was a survivor, a fighter, and a healer. His story was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always a way forward, that with patience, love, and determination, even the most broken beings could find their way back to the light. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, Sarah whispered softly, "You did it, Chance. You found your way home."